What would you do if the only family you ever wanted was standing right in front of you, but the proof you needed was missing? For years, Tu Tien has lived in the quiet shadows of a humble village, a girl with no past, only the persistent, aching memory of a home she couldn't name. Today, that silence is shattered. Two women have traveled hundreds of miles from the mountains of Caobang, eyes weary from a decade of searching for a lost granddaughter. But when their paths finally cross in a dusty, sun-drenched courtyard, the joy of a potential reunion is met with a cold, devastating truth. One mole, one birthmark, and one heart-wrenching revelation will change everything. Is this a miracle or the most cruel twist of fate? The construction site at the edge of the village hummed with the aggressive rattle of machinery. Jack, a sharp-eyed construction engineer, stood amidst the dust, his focus absolute. Beside him, Hiep, his lead foreman, traced the lines of the foundation. "Jack, the ground is prepped," Hiep shouted over the roar of a steamroller. "We've leveled it. The foundation will be rock solid." Jack scanned the site, his jaw tight. "Good. If the foundation is off by even an inch, the whole structure fails. I want this project perfect. No mistakes." "Understood," Hiep nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. "My team is on it." As Jack turned to leave, a flash of movement at the edge of the site caught his eye. It was Tu Tien, returning from the forest, her arms heavy with a basket of wild honey jackfruit. She looked fragile, a stark contrast to the heavy, unyielding industry of the construction site. Jack felt his chest tighten. He knew her burden, the void of her missing identity, better than anyone. If only she could find what she's looking for, he thought. If only I could give it to her. Miles away, near the village gate, an old woman named Badep clutched a worn bag. Her face was a roadmap of sorrow and decades of waiting. Beside her, a woman who had helped coordinate their journey kept a steady, comforting hand on her shoulder. "You're sure this is the place?" Badep whispered, her voice trembling like a dry leaf. "I'm sure, Ba." The girl described fits the age, the details, everything. The woman reassured her. "Let's find her." They arrived at Tu Tien's small, quiet house. It was empty. The silence was heavy, broken only by the distant sounds of the construction crew. They stood in the yard, hope flickering in their eyes, waiting. When Tu Tien finally appeared, the air seemed to stand still. "Who are you?" Tu Tien asked, her voice soft but guarded. "I am Badep," the older woman breathed, tears already pooling in her eyes. "I've come from Caobang. I've been looking for my granddaughter for years." You look just like her." The invitation to sit was quick, but the tension was suffocating. When Jack returned, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, he joined them. "I've been trying to find her family for years," Jack explained to the visitors, his hand finding Tu Tien's under the table. "She was lost as a child. She doesn't remember her parents, but she remembers the pain of being alone." Badep leaned forward, her hands trembling. "My granddaughter has a mole behind her ear, and a birthmark on her leg." Tu Tien gasped, her hand flying to her neck. "I have the mole? I've always had it." The room went deathly silent. For a heartbeat, hope bright, blinding, and warm flooded the space. It was the answer to a decade of prayers. But then, Tu Tien stood up, her face pale. She pulled up her trouser leg, revealing smooth, unblemished skin. "I don't have the birthmark," she whispered, her voice breaking. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it was a physical weight. The light in Badep's eyes died, replaced by a hollow exhaustion. "I see," the old woman said, slumping back into her chair. "Not you. Not my girl. I'm so sorry." Tu Tien sobbed, burying her face in her hands. "I know how much you wanted to find her. I wanted it too. I wanted to be her." Jack watched them, his heart aching. He saw the cruelty of the moment, the hope that had been dangled, then snatched away. He stepped in, his voice firm but filled with empathy. "You've traveled so far. You cannot leave tonight. The road to the town is long and dangerous. Please, stay. Eat with us. Let us rest our souls together." Dinner was a somber affair, yet filled with a fragile, strange warmth. They ate steamed rice and bamboo shoot soup in the dim light of the kitchen. Despite the disappointment, the bond between the grandmother and the girl who could have been her granddaughter remained. "You are a kind girl," Ba Dep said, reaching out to pat Tu Tien's hand. "Even if you are not my blood, you have a spirit that feels like family. When I go back to Kalbang, I will not forget this, and you have a place here," Tu Tien promised, though her eyes remained glossy with unshed tears. "Whenever you return, this door is open." As the evening deepened, the guests moved to prepare for sleep. Jack pulled Tu Tien aside, away from the prying ears of the house. He saw the struggle in her eyes, the constant battle between the desire to belong and the reality of her isolation. "Don't carry this, Tien," Jack whispered, wrapping her in a protective embrace. "You are not defined by a birthmark. You are defined by the person you are today. You are brave, you are kind, and you are loved." "I just wanted to know, Jack," she murmured against his shoulder. "I wanted to know where I came from. Every time someone comes looking for a lost child, I hope, and every time they leave, a part of me feels lost all over again. Then we will keep looking," Jack promised. "We will find your path, even if it's not the one we expected tonight." The next morning, the mist clung to the trees like a shroud. The departure was quiet. There were no grand speeches, only the heavy, dignified weight of farewells. Ba Dep looked back one last time at the house, her eyes lingering on Tu Tien, who stood on the porch with Jack. "Take care of yourself," the old woman said, her voice steady now. "Life has a way of leading us home, even if the road is winding." As the car pulled away, kicking up dust on the narrow village road, Tu Tien stood still. The construction work in the distance started up again, a constant, rhythmic reminder that life continues, regardless of the pieces we lose. "Are you okay?" Jack asked, stepping onto the porch beside her. Tu Tien took a deep breath, the crisp mountain air filling her lungs. The ache was still there, a dull throb in her chest, but the sharpness had faded. She looked at Jack, the man who stayed, the man who built a foundation for her when she had none of her own. "I'm ready," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I don't know who I was before, but I know who I am now, and that has to be enough." Jack nodded, his hand sliding into hers. They watched the horizon together. The mystery of her origin remained, an open loop in the story of her life. But as they turned back toward the house, the sun broke through the clouds, casting a golden light over the courtyard. They weren't just waiting for the past anymore. They were building a future. The construction project moved forward. Steel beams rose like skeletons against the sky. Every strike of the hammer, every pour of concrete, felt like a step toward a new stability. Tu Tien began to find rhythm in the small tasks, the harvest, the cooking, the quiet moments of companionship. But sometimes, in the dead of night, she would stare at her own reflection and trace the mole behind her ear. She would wonder if somewhere in the mountains, another pair of eyes was tracing the same feature on a different girl. She realized then that family wasn't just about blood or birthmarks. It was about the people who sat at your table when you were at your lowest. It was about the hand that reached out when you felt the world slipping away. The drama of that day had left a scar, yes, but it had also stitched them closer together. Jack's dedication to his work mirrored his dedication to her, a slow, deliberate process of creating something that would last. "You don't need a past to have a legacy," Jack had told her once. She believed him now. As the construction project neared completion, the villagers whispered about the resilience of the girl who walked her path with dignity. They didn't know the pain behind her smile, but they saw the strength. And for Tu Tien, that was the most meaningful reward of all. She had lost the chance at a history, but she had gained the courage to write her own future. And as the rain began to fall, washing away the dust of the construction site, Tu Tien stood in the doorway, watching the water nourish the earth, waiting for whatever beauty or sorrow the next season would bring. She was no longer just the girl who was lost. She was the woman who had found her own way home. The journey for the truth about her bloodline wasn't over, but the urgency had keyed into a mature, bittersweet acceptance. She had learned that grief is just love, with nowhere to go. She had given her love to the grandmother who needed it, and in return, she had received a moment of connection that warmed her heart through the coldest nights. In the end, it wasn't about finding the person she was meant to be. It was about accepting the person she had fought to become. The construction site stood complete, a testament to Jack's skill, but the house, their house, felt more like a fortress of peace. They had survived the interrogation of the past. They were ready for the peace of the present. And somewhere, across the miles, perhaps the real granddaughter was doing the same, building her own life, wondering about the family that had spent a lifetime searching for her. The story was far from finished. The mystery of the birthmark and the bloodline remained, a quiet whisper in the wind. But as Tu Tien looked toward the mountains of Caobang, she didn't feel the need to chase the fog anymore. She stood firmly on the ground, the solid foundation of her own life beneath her feet. "What are you thinking about?" Jack asked, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. "I'm thinking," Tu Tien said, leaning back into his warmth, "that sometimes the things we lose aren't meant to be found. They are meant to teach us how to be found by the people who stay." Jack didn't answer. He didn't need to. He just held her, a silent promise in the quiet of the evening. The wind blew, the leaves rustled, and the village returned to its gentle, predictable rhythm. The girl who had no name had found a home, not in the past, but in the arms of the man who saw her, heard her, and loved her. Not for the marks on her skin, but for the light in her soul. And in that moment, for the very first time, Tu Tien felt truly, deeply at peace. The search for the lost was over. The life of the found had begun. But as the light faded, a lone phone call interrupted the quiet. A ringing that echoed through the house, a sudden, sharp sound that made them both freeze. Was it news from the mountains? A discovery that had come too late? The screen glowed in the dark, an unknown number from Caobang. Tu Tien looked at Jack. The cycle of hope, the weight of the past, the terrifying beauty of the unknown, it all rushed back in a single, heart-stopping second. "Should I answer it?" she whispered. Jack reached out, his hand hovering over the device. "Whatever it is," he said, his eyes filled with a fierce, protective love, "we face it together." The screen continued to glow, a beacon in the darkness, pulling them back toward the life they had tried to leave behind. The ending was not a conclusion, but a new, dangerous, and beautiful beginning. The mystery was far from over, and for Tu Tien, the question was no longer where she came from, but what she would do when the past finally caught up to her. She took a breath, reached out, and pressed accept. The story, after all, was only just beginning. The voice on the other end was frantic, old, and unmistakably familiar. It was the woman from the village, the one who had helped Badep. "Tien, are you there? We found something. You need to come to Caobang. You need to see this." Tien's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked at Jack, her eyes wide with a mix of terror and electric anticipation. "What did you find?" she gasped. "The birthmark," the voice crackled. "It's not what you think. It wasn't missing. "You were just looking in the wrong place." The phone line went dead, leaving them in a silence so thick it was deafening. The open loop pulled at them, a magnetic force dragging them toward the mountains they had only dreamed of. "We have to go," Jack said, his voice hard with resolve. "Are you sure?" Tien asked, trembling. "What if it's another disappointment? What if I break again?" Jack took her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheeks. "If you break, I will hold the pieces. We go tomorrow." The packing was frantic, a blur of movement and suppressed emotion. They left the house, the construction site, and the life they had carefully built. They drove toward the mountains, toward the origin of the woman she was supposed to be. The road to Cao Bang was treacherous, a winding ribbon of dirt and asphalt that clung to the edges of cliffs. Every turn was a test, every bump a hurdle. They were driving into the heart of the mystery, into the very shadow of her past. What would they find in the mountains? Would it be the family she had mourned? Or would it be a new, more dangerous truth that threatened everything she had become? The mountains loomed ahead, dark and imposing, hiding secrets that had been buried for 20 years. Tu Tien felt the weight of her history pressing down on her, a physical force that threatened to pull her under. But beside her, Jack was a constant, a rock in the churning sea of her emotions. He drove with a focus that kept them safe, his eyes constantly scanning the road, his hand occasionally finding hers, a grounding anchor in the chaos. They arrived in the village at dusk. The houses were old, made of wood and stone, huddled together against the cold mountain air. The woman who had called was waiting for them under the porch of a small, dilapidated shack. "You came," she whispered, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and guilt. "What is it?" Tien asked, stepping out of the car. "What did you find?" The woman reached into her bag and pulled out a small, faded photograph. It was a picture of a child with a mole behind her ear, and a small, distinct birthmark on her ankle. Tien stared at the photo, her world spinning. The child was her, but the location in the photo wasn't the village. It was the house she had grown up in, the house she had been lost from. "This photo," the woman explained, her voice shaking, "was taken the day you disappeared. But there was someone else there, Tien. Someone who wasn't supposed to be." The revelation hit Tien like a physical blow. It wasn't an accident. It was a theft. The pieces of the puzzle began to click into place, a picture emerging that was far more sinister than she had ever imagined. The disappearance, the loss, the years of searching it hadn't been a tragedy of fate. It had been a calculated act of cruelty. "Who?" Tien demanded, her voice barely a whisper. "Who took me?" The woman looked toward the house, her eyes filled with a terror that made Tien's skin crawl. "The person you call Ba Dep." The truth was a poison, a slow-acting venom that seeped into her veins. Ba Dep, the grandmother who had spent 20 years searching, had been the one to pull her from her mother's arms. Everything she had felt, the pity, the empathy, the shared grief had been a mask. A carefully crafted facade to keep her from digging too deep, to keep her in the dark. Tien felt her knees buckle. Jack caught her, his arms wrapping around her like a shield. "Tien, breathe," he urged, his voice tight with controlled rage. But Tien couldn't breathe. She was staring at the photo, at the young, innocent face of the child she had been, and then at the old, calculating face of the woman who had stolen her life. The world had shifted. The ground beneath her feet was no longer solid. The past she had been searching for had finally caught up to her, and it was far darker, far more treacherous than she could have ever conceived. The search was over. The real story was just beginning. And as the mountain wind howled a mournful, lonely sound, Tu Tien realized that the grandmother she had pitied was the architect of her own misery. The game had changed. The hunter had become the hunted. And as she looked toward the house where Ba Dep waited, Tu Tien felt a cold, sharp strength growing inside her, a desire for truth, for justice, and for the vengeance of a stolen life. She turned to Jack, her eyes burning with a new, dangerous resolve. "Let's go," she said. The mountain air bit at her skin, but she didn't feel it. She only felt the fire, the burning, desperate need for the truth. The story of the lost girl had ended. The story of the woman who would take it all back had begun. The door to the house creaked open, and there, sitting in the shadows, was Ba Dep. She looked older, smaller, and her eyes were filled with a cunning that had been hidden behind the veil of sorrow for all these years. She looked at the photo in Ten's hand, then up at her, and she smiled. It wasn't the smile of a grieving grandmother. It was the smile of a predator who had just realized her prey had found the trap. "So," Ba Dep whispered, her voice a rasping, chilling sound, "you finally know. The truth was out. The secret was broken." And in the silence of the mountain shack, the battle for the truth began.